Hey, this is Bunny. Today we're taking a look at one of the most recognizable creatures in all of Dungeons and Dragons, the humble wolf. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Out of all the dragons and beholders and mind flayers and bizarre horrors wandering around the multiverse, I choose wolves? Yep, because sometimes the creatures that seem the simplest end up having some of the richest lore once you start digging. While I work at painting these two wolves, I thought we'd wander through the forests, mountains, frozen tundras, and forgotten corners of D&D history to see how these animals have been portrayed over the decades. They aren't flashy, they don't breathe fire, they don't cast spells, but they've earned a permanent place in fantasy for a very good reason. One of the things that has always fascinated me is that D&D rarely treats wolves as monsters. That's an important distinction. Plenty of creatures exist simply to attack adventurers on sight, but wolves are almost always presented as animals first. They hunt because they're hungry. They defend their territory because that's where they live. They protect their young because that's what parents do. If a group of adventurers wanders into their hunting grounds and starts making a racket, the wolves aren't plotting world domination. They're just trying to survive. I think that's one of the reasons they've remained so enduring across every edition of the game. They're relatable in ways that a floating eyeball covered in lasers simply isn't. That idea also fits beautifully into the title of this series, The Gentle and the Wild. Wolves manage to embody both halves at the same time. They are certainly wild animals, capable hunters that deserve respect, but they also are deeply social creatures. They care for one another. They raise pups together. They rely on cooperation rather than brute strength. Modern biology has done a wonderful job of correcting many misconceptions about real wolves over the last few decades, and interestingly enough, D&D often reflected that more balanced view long before it became common knowledge. The game has consistently portrayed wolves as intelligent, coordinated members of the natural world instead of mindless killing machines. If you've played almost any edition of Dungeons & Dragons, chances are you've encountered wolves fairly early in an adventure. They're often among the first dangerous predators that new adventurers meet once they leave the safety of town. That placement isn't accidental. Wolves teach players an important lesson. They demonstrate that even ordinary animals can become dangerous when they work together. A single wolf may not seem particularly intimidating, but a coordinated pack can surround careless travelers, cut off escape routes, and force difficult decisions. It's an early reminder that numbers, planning, and teamwork matter just as much as raw strength. One thing that surprises many people is just how patient D&D wolves are described as being. They aren't reckless creatures that immediately leap out of the bushes the moment they spot prey. Quite the opposite. Across multiple editions, wolves are described as shadowing travelers for long distances. They'll watch from the tree line. They'll test whether a group notices them. They'll wait for someone to fall behind or become separated. It's a style of hunting built on observation rather than impulse. Honestly, if I had to choose one word to describe wolves in D&D, it wouldn't be fierce. It would probably be patient. That patience comes from the fact that wolves almost never hunt alone. The pack is the heart of wolf lore, both in reality and throughout D&D. Every individual has a role to play. Some drive prey in a particular direction. Others wait for the perfect moment to intercept. Younger wolves learn from older pack members. Injured animals may still contribute by watching pups or helping defend territory. Even though the game doesn't spend pages describing wolf sociology, that sense of cooperation quietly appears again and again throughout the lore. A wolf isn't really meant to be understood as an individual. It's part of something larger than itself. Now, if you've spent any time online over the past decade, you've probably encountered the endless discussions about alpha wolves. Those conversations usually have more to do with internet culture than actual wolves. Modern wildlife research has shown that wild wolf packs are typically family groups led by breeding parents rather than constant competitions for dominance. D&D doesn't really dive into that scientific debate, but interestingly, its descriptions of wolf packs often resemble healthy family units far more than the exaggerated alpha versus beta stereotypes. Packs cooperate because they're related, and because working together helps everyone survive. That's a much more interesting story than constant internal fighting. Another thing D&D consistently emphasizes is intelligence. Not human intelligence, of course, but animal intelligence pushed nearly to its limits. Wolves remember trails. They recognize dangerous areas. They learn from previous encounters. If one member of the pack discovers that a particular ravine contains a hidden danger, the others don't keep charging it over and over again. They're adaptable creatures that learn through experience. Adventurers who underestimate them because they aren't magical often discover that clever predators can be every bit as dangerous as spellcasters. Communication is another fascinating part of wolf behavior. We all think about the iconic howl, and yes, D&D absolutely embraces that image. A howl can gather scattered pack members, warn rivals away from territory, or simply announce a pack's presence across the wilderness. But wolves communicate constantly in quieter ways as well. Ear position, tail movements, posture, growls, whines, and scent all play a role. Imagine walking through an ancient forest where you only notice the occasional distant howl, never realizing that half a dozen wolves have been silently communicating around you for the last 10 minutes without making any other sound. That's a wonderfully atmospheric image for a fantasy setting. Speaking of forests, wolves appear across a remarkable variety of environments throughout D&D. Dense woodlands are probably the most familiar home, but they also roam rolling hills, rugged mountains, broad grasslands, and even frozen tundras. What matters most isn't the specific terrain, but the availability of prey and enough wilderness to support a healthy pack. Unlike many fantasy creatures that exist because a wizard accidentally exploded a laboratory somewhere, wolves fit naturally into almost any landscape. They belong there. They make the wilderness feel alive instead of simply empty. Because wolves are such natural creatures, they often become closely associated with druids and rangers. In many adventures, a druid isn't commanding wolves through magic so much as earning their trust through mutual respect. Rangers frequently travel alongside wolf companions because the two share similar values. Both survive by reading tracks, understanding the weather, moving quietly, and respecting the balance of nature. I rather like that relationship because it isn't built on domination. The wolf isn't a disposable tool, it's a partner. That's a subtle but meaningful difference, and it says quite a bit about how D&D views the natural world. As these little miniatures slowly start to look more like wolves and less like vaguely canine blobs covered in primer, it's worth remembering that ordinary wolves are only the beginning of the story. D&D has spent decades expanding the wolf family into creatures that range from oversized prehistoric hunters to intelligent beings capable of speech and diplomacy. Some remain firmly rooted in nature, while others wander the realms of myth and magic. The direwolf is one of those wonderful examples where D&D borrowed something from the real world and then let fantasy take over. Direwolves were actually prehistoric animals that once roamed North America alongside mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. The real creatures were larger and more powerfully built than modern gray wolves, though perhaps not quite as enormous as fantasy often imagines them to be. D&D looked at that fascinating piece of natural history and essentially said, let's make them even bigger. The result is a creature that feels believable enough to fit into the natural world, while still being impressive enough to make adventurers think twice before wandering into its territory. Unlike ordinary wolves, direwolves tend to be portrayed as truly massive predators. Depending on the edition and the artwork, they can stand nearly as tall as a horse's shoulder, with jaws capable of bringing down prey that most wolves wouldn't even consider challenging. Yet despite their size, they aren't presented as clumsy beasts. They're still wolves. They still rely on speed, endurance, and cooperation. If anything, the frightening part isn't simply how large they are, but that they retain all the patience and coordination of their smaller cousins. Imagine watching a pack of creatures that weigh several hundred pounds, each moving almost silently through the trees. Suddenly, those distant snapping twigs become much more concerning. One detail I appreciate is that D&D generally doesn't turn direwolves into monsters simply because they're larger. They aren't evil. They aren't corrupted. They're ancient predators occupying a different ecological niche. A herd of elk, a giant boar, or perhaps even a reckless ogre might all be perfectly reasonable prey from a direwolf's perspective. Adventurers who stumble into the middle of that food chain quickly discover that nature doesn't really care how many magic items you're carrying. Sometimes you're simply standing where something much bigger intends to have dinner. Across various editions, direwolves often live in smaller packs than ordinary wolves. That makes sense if you think about it. A dozen enormous predators would need an incredible amount of food to survive. Smaller family groups are easier to support while still allowing the cooperative hunting behavior that defines wolves in general. It's one of those little details that helps the fantasy feel grounded. The writers weren't just making everything bigger because bigger sounds cooler. At least occasionally, someone stopped to consider how such creatures might realistically survive. Then we leave the realm of natural history and step firmly into fantasy with one of my favorite variants, the winter wolf. If ordinary wolves represent nature and dire wolves represent prehistoric nature turned up to 11, winter wolves represent magic itself taking the shape of a predator. These creatures aren't simply large white wolves living in snowy climates. They're intelligent beings with their own goals, personalities, and cultures. A winter wolf isn't just deciding where to hunt today. It might be negotiating with frost giants, defending a territory that has belonged to its pack for generations, or plotting against rival winter wolves. Visually, winter wolves are exactly what you hoped they'd be. Thick white coats help them disappear against fresh snow, while pale blue or silver eyes make them seem almost supernatural. Artwork across the editions tends to emphasize just how perfectly they blend into frozen landscapes. There's something wonderfully unsettling about the idea that a snowy hillside might not be empty at all. The hunter could be watching you from only a few yards away, hidden by nothing more than the landscape itself. Fantasy has always loved creatures that use illusion, but winter wolves achieve something similar by belonging exactly where they live. Perhaps the greatest difference between winter wolves and ordinary wolves is intelligence. These creatures can speak. They can bargain, threaten, negotiate, and deceive. That changes everything. A meeting with a normal wolf pack is usually about whether the animals perceive you as a threat or potential prey. A meeting with a winter wolf could become a conversation, an alliance, or a carefully planned betrayal. Suddenly, the encounter becomes less about surviving an animal attack and more about dealing with another thinking person who simply happens to have 4 legs and an impressive collection of teeth. Winter wolves are also famous for their association with frost giants. Across multiple settings and editions, the two are frequently depicted hunting together or sharing territory. I like that relationship because it doesn't usually feel like ownership. The giants aren't keeping oversized guard dogs. Instead, it often comes across as a partnership between 2 dangerous predators who benefit from each other's strengths. It's a reminder that intelligence doesn't always lead creatures towards civilization. Sometimes it simply makes them better at surviving the harshest environments imaginable. Of course, once we have intelligent wolves, it isn't long before we encounter perhaps the most misunderstood members of the family, worgs. If you've ever wondered why Tolkien fans occasionally talk about wargs, while D&D players usually say wargs, there's actually a bit of publishing history behind that. Early versions borrowed Tolkien's terminology, but later editions adopted the name warg to avoid legal complications. The creature evolved into its own distinct thing, and over the decades, wargs developed personalities and cultures quite separate from anything Tolkien originally envisioned. Although they certainly resemble wolves, wargs really shouldn't be thought of as animals at all. They're fully intelligent beings with languages, societies, ambitions, and often a distinctly unpleasant outlook on life. While ordinary wolves cooperate because cooperation helps the pack survive, wargs often cooperate because they can gain power, wealth, or influence. They willingly form alliances with goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, and orcs, sometimes serving as mounts, sometimes acting as equals, and occasionally becoming leaders in their own right. They're driven by calculation rather than instinct. That difference in motivation completely changes how they feel within a story. If a party encounters hungry wolves, there may be ways to avoid conflict. Back away slowly, leave the territory. Make yourself seem like more trouble than you're worth. A conversation with a warg is much less predictable. It understands fear, it understands greed, and it understands lies. Sometimes it may honor an agreement. Sometimes it may decide that eating the negotiator is simply the more entertaining option. Intelligence, after all, doesn't automatically make someone kind. As I'm putting the finishing touches on these wolf miniatures, I keep thinking about how remarkable it is that D&D managed to create such a broad family of wolf-like creatures without losing sight of what makes wolves feel like, well, wolves. Whether they're ordinary pack hunters, gigantic prehistoric predators, magical beings of the frozen north, or sinister wargs plotting alongside goblins, they all retain that unmistakable silhouette and that deeply rooted sense of cooperation. Even their differences help us appreciate what makes each branch of the family unique. And there are still a few lesser-known members of the family tree to explore before we're done. Not every wolf in D&D fits neatly into one of the well-known categories. In fact, one of the joys of exploring decades of source books is discovering all the unusual variants that quietly appear in specific settings or adventures. Some of these creatures only showed up once or twice before fading into obscurity, while others became recurring ideas that different writers interpreted in their own ways. They may never have achieved the popularity of direwolves or winterwolves, but together they paint a picture of just how versatile the humble wolf can be within fantasy. One recurring idea is the spirit wolf. Unlike ordinary wolves, spirit wolves aren't really flesh and blood animals at all. Depending on the setting, they might be ancestral guardians, manifestations of nature itself, protectors of sacred places, or the lingering souls of wolves that continue watching over their territory long after death. Some adventures portray them as benevolent guides that appear only to those who respect the wilderness. Others make them mysterious observers that never directly interfere unless the balance of nature is threatened. They're less interested in hunting prey than in preserving the forest, mountains, or valleys they call home. Closely related to that idea are celestial wolves. These appear only occasionally throughout D&D's history, but they're fascinating because they turn the familiar image of the wolf into something almost divine. Instead of representing the dangers of the wilderness, celestial wolves often symbolize loyalty, protection, and justice. Their coats are frequently described as silver or brilliantly white, almost glowing beneath the moonlight. Rather than stalking frightened travelers, they're more likely to appear beside celestial beings or serve deities connected with nature, hunting, or the stars. If ordinary wolves remind adventurers to respect nature, celestial wolves remind them that goodness can also possess sharp teeth. Then, naturally, D&D offers the opposite end of the spectrum. Shadow-touched wolves appear in several adventures and campaign settings, transformed by prolonged exposure to dark magic or places steeped in shadow. These wolves aren't usually evil by birth. Instead, they're ordinary animals altered by forces beyond their understanding. Their coats often become unnaturally black, their movements strangely silent, and their eyes seem to catch what little light exists. I actually find them a little tragic. They're less like villains and more like victims, creatures twisted by environments they never chose to inhabit. Older editions also experimented with fiendish wolves, particularly during the 3rd edition era, where many ordinary animals received infernal or abyssal variants. These wolves might possess glowing eyes, unnatural resilience, or a disturbing hostility toward holy creatures. Unlike shadow wolves, which often feel corrupted by circumstance, fiendish wolves are usually portrayed as having been deliberately warped by dark planar influences. Even so, beneath those supernatural alterations, you can still recognize the instincts of a wolf. The fantasy elements add to the creature, rather than replacing its essential nature. There are also creatures that people often mistake for wolves, even though they are technically not wolves at all. Blink dogs are probably the best example. At first glance, they resemble canines, but they're actually magical creatures famous for their ability to teleport short distances. They're generally associated with goodness, and often oppose evil creatures like displacer beasts. Despite their wolf-like appearance, blink dogs behave much more like highly intelligent magical dogs than true wolves. They're loyal, friendly toward good-hearted adventurers, and considerably more approachable than most members of the wolf family we've discussed today. Another obscure entry from early editions is the moon dog. Despite the name, these beings are not simply wolves under a different label. Moon dogs are celestial creatures associated with the upper planes, and they're far more mystical than natural. They embody ideals of protection, goodness, and cosmic order, rather than wilderness survival. Most players never encounter one in an actual campaign, but I always enjoy stumbling across these forgotten corners of D&D history. They remind us that the game has spent decades experimenting with familiar animal forms in wonderfully imaginative ways. Beyond individual species, wolves also have fascinating relationships with other inhabitants in the D&D multiverse. Druids, as we mentioned earlier, often view wolves as respected neighbors rather than pets. Rangers may travel alongside them as trusted companions. Elves frequently coexist with wolf packs in ancient forests, sharing the same landscapes without trying to dominate one another. On the opposite end of the spectrum, goblins and orcs often seek to tame wolves or partner with wargs for hunting and warfare. Frost giants build long-standing alliances with winter wolves, while fey creatures sometimes treat wolves as guardians of enchanted woodlands. Every relationship reflects something about both sides involved. One thing that has remained remarkably consistent from the earliest editions right up to modern D&D is the symbolic role wolves play. Dragons often symbolize power, unicorns symbolize purity, beholders represent paranoia and absolute control. Wolves, however, almost always represent community. They stand for loyalty, endurance, family, cooperation, and the untamed beauty of the natural world. That's a surprisingly optimistic role for an animal that so many cultures once feared. Rather than becoming symbols of mindless violence, D&D repeatedly presents wolves as reminders that survival often depends on trusting those around you. That's one reason I think wolves have aged so well within the game. Some classic monsters have changed dramatically over the years as new writers reinvented them or updated older lore. Wolves haven't really needed much revision because they already were built upon something timeless. Real wolves are endlessly fascinating. Their family bonds, communication, intelligence, and resilience provide more than enough inspiration without needing to reinvent them every edition. The fantasy simply grows naturally from those foundations instead of replacing them. Good fantasy often works that way. It begins with something recognizable before asking, what if? As I've been painting these two wolves, I found myself appreciating that balance even more. They're not covered in elaborate armor. They don't have glowing runes carved into their fur. They aren't carrying enchanted weapons or wearing tiny wizard hats, although I admit that that would be pretty cute. They're simply wolves. Sometimes fantasy doesn't need to become more complicated to become more interesting. Sometimes all it needs is a creature that already inspires respect and curiosity, placed into a world where ancient forests stretch for hundreds of miles and forgotten ruins lie hidden beneath the trees. Wolves in Dungeons & Dragons are fascinating. They're a family of creatures that has quietly grown alongside the game itself. From ordinary wolves keeping the wilderness alive, to dire wolves carrying echoes of prehistory, to winter wolves ruling frozen landscapes with frightening intelligence, to wargs choosing ambition over instinct. Every branch adds another layer to the story. Together they remind us that not every memorable creature needs to be the biggest or the most magical. Sometimes the most enduring legends begin with something as familiar as a wolf's howl echoing through the trees. That's about it for today. I'd love to hear what type of wolf you'd be most interested in meeting or avoiding in your own D&D adventures, and whether there are any lesser-known wolf variants you've encountered that I didn't mention. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!